within environmentalism, there is a strand of thinking which I think has been left behind by the science, which is that, well, you know, these cattle and sheep grazing in lovely flowering pastures, surely that's what we need to preserve. And unfortunately, while it looks nice, it simply doesn't stack up. As soon as you start looking at the numbers, the case for livestock falls apart, but particularly the case for the kind of livestock production that many environmentalists favor, which is organic pasture-fed meat production, particularly beef and lamb, which is arguably the worst possible of all agricultural products, worse even than non-organic pasture-fed beef and lamb, and much, much worse than the horrible production of chicken and pork in huge factories, which we all hate so much, and rightly. But in environmental terms, the worst food you can eat that is produced by farming is pasture-fed organic meat.
And I mean, to say that, I find it quite shocking. And I know I recently interviewed the CEO of Impossible Foods, which makes plant-based burgers, and you mentioned them in your book. And I posted the story I wrote on Facebook, and I have a friend who's an organic farmer in Wales who was absolutely horrified by the idea that suddenly we're taking away something which, as you say, seems idyllic, which seems very nice, both culturally, aesthetically, and in terms of our food production, to what seems to be an industrialization of our food. And how do you reconcile these? Because in other books, you've mentioned very clearly, you know, what's gone wrong with the world, and corporate interests and an over-reliance on technology and industrialization is part of perhaps what's gone wrong. So how do you reconcile this need for technology and industrialization to a certain extent with the need to reconnect with nature?
Well, none of these things are easy to reconcile. There's payoffs everywhere, and there's no pure and perfect solution at all. But the first thing to say is, you know, we have to get away from means of food production which require a massive environmental cost. And pasture-fed meat comes top of those simply because of the land area it occupies. It requires so much land, and that means a huge ecological opportunity cost, because all that land could otherwise be supporting forests and wetlands and other rich ecosystems. Pasture covers 28% of the world's area. That's more than twice as much as all the crops on Earth. And yet animals which survive purely on grazing produce only 1% of our protein. This is a phenomenally profligate means of producing food, and it's just not environmentally affordable. And the only reason why there seems to be plenty of pasture-fed steak and pasture-fed lamb around is that we are using so much land to produce it. It's amazingly inefficient. So the alternative is not, I believe, to go down the route of factory animal farming, even though that's much more efficient in terms of land use and has lower greenhouse gas emissions. There are also huge problems involved with that, particularly the concentration of livestock in river catchments, which simply can't absorb the amount of nutrients that they produce in their dung. And everywhere we see the factory farming of livestock, we see dead rivers. And then at the other end of the chain, we see a massive production of grain to feed those livestock. We now see roughly half the world's calories grown by farmers going into the mouths of livestock, which is a tremendously inefficient way of using grain. And of course, a huge amount of fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation, other damaging practices associated with growing that grain. So that's not an answer either. But we need protein and we need fat, as well as the carbohydrates that we get directly from grains. So how do we best produce those? Well, I feel that, sort of like the cavalry, just in the nick of time, the necessary technology has come along, which is precision fermentation, growing microbes in vats, the same way as we grow them when we're making beer or producing baker's yeast, for example, and using them directly to produce protein and fat. And it's massively more efficient in terms of land, in terms of water, in terms of nutrients. Every single environmental measure you can imagine is greatly reduced by producing our food that way. But you're absolutely right to point out that there's a real danger that it could fall into the hands of a few large corporations and become highly concentrated in those hands. And already in the food sector, we see a very small number of companies mopping up a very large part of global food trade, particularly in grains and meats. So it's already a huge problem. We don't want to see that replicated in the new food technologies. It's really important we avoid that. So my call to other people concerned about this is to say, don't attack the technology, but attack the means by which it can be concentrated. Let's get in there at the beginning, because we are more or less at the beginning, and ensure that this becomes a distributed and socially just technology rather than one which is captured by a few huge corporations. And for that, what we need are weak patents and strong antitrust laws. And I think that combination is a pretty good formula for all business right across the board. Patents, intellectual property should be weak, antitrust laws should be strong. We shouldn't allow a few corporations to mop everything up. Now, if that were the case, if we could have a distributed economy producing these fats and proteins from microbes with a very low environmental impact, we could also have a far more just food economy than we have at the moment, because you can produce them anywhere, particularly places, because you want to do this in the greenest possible way and they rely on electricity, places with a lot of ambient energy striking the ground, a lot of potential solar power, which includes many of the poorest nations on earth, could be producing their own fat and protein without having to go through the global food chain. Local businesses could be turning it out with specifically for the needs of local markets. And paradoxically, because a lot of food sovereignty campaigners really hate this idea, it could actually deliver food sovereignty and food justice and food security far more effectively than the current forms of global food production do.